sort of the banality of evil, to use Hannah Arendt's title when she wrote about Eichmann, but about like the living next there and how they just sort of live their lives,
Yeah.
without. And so the guy's he's steeped in this, and he said we stand up here. I think he was talking for his producers and refute our Jewishness and the Holocaust, and that's where like apparently some reporting put a period.
Yeah,
But he said
the
we
Hollywood
refute.
Reporter, I think, or no, Variety did that, which is
Yeah,
insane. Like, this
insane.
is a premier establishment journalistic outlet for all things Hollywood. The fact that they would flub this quote, I don't think it's a mistake. I just like I can't chalk this up as like a simple mistake. I think that they wanted to draw that out. Like, this is a trade publication. That is what they wanted to draw out of that speech.
I mean, whether it was just like incredible incompetence or nefarious, regardless, people ran with that. And the actual statement was we stand up here and refute our Judaism and the Holocaust being used as a shield or a justification for, the onslaught. I don't know how he phrased it in Gaza.
Yeah.
And so the idea, and that's a sentiment. I mean, I think that, frankly, a lot of Jews in this country and around the world feel. I mean, you hear a lot of the protesters yelling "Not in our name." That's what they're talking about. Is that the idea of killing civilians and what Israel is doing is really fundamentally contrary to, I think, a lot of people's perceived ideas of Judaism
Yeah.
aside. And certainly to see the Holocaust, which is, I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week as a kid, but Hebrew was about like number 3 or 4 on what we learned. We learned about the Holocaust. We learned about Israel. And then really cultural things about Judaism. And when I went to Hebrew school, it was only 30 years out from the Holocaust. I mean, I was 10 in 1975. And so, I had teachers, Hebrew school teachers, with a number tattooed to their arm. And the message of the Holocaust, at least that we were taught, was never again. But it wasn't just about Jews. It was supposed to be, never this type of wholesale slaughter. And so to see these things invoked as a defense or a justification for this genocide in Gaza is beyond the just sort of, I think, you don't need to be Jewish or religious or anything to find what's going on there abhorrent. But it's one more sort of indignity.
Yeah. I wanted to show you another thing from Variety. I'm going to share my screen with you right now, so you can see what I'm seeing. At least here it is. This is the same Variety trade publication that claimed IDFA's artistic director apologized after protesters crash opening night with banner calling for destruction of Israel. Now, the banner that was calling for the destruction of Israel, of course, read, and this is back from November 10th, was, of course, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, obviously, discourse has changed from back then, but if you recall, this was around the same time when Rashida Tlaib was censured. But as a trade publication, they still went along with this narrative that, like, saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is actually calling for the death and destruction of Israel at a time when this was the hot button issue. So.
Right.
Just some ways in which I think even areas that you would not expect being political while using neutral language and objective reporting from a trade publication that like is supposed to cover Hollywood, still making an assessment, making a statement, and showing bias, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, I mean, without a doubt. And I mean, you don't need it to see it just in the context of Hollywood. I think, particularly, there may be a slight change in tone in some of the news media. I think as of late, but certainly at the beginning, and there's always been this sort of deference to Israel. And as someone who was steeped in this as a kid, it took a long time, I think, for me to be fully conscious of that, of just how, steeped it is. I mean, I always knew there was a bias, but I think like you're really seeing in this conflict because everybody seems to be weighing in. I mean, you mentioned I've been doing this for a while. It's actually going to be the 20th anniversary of the Majority Report in like 2 or 3 weeks.
Wow.
And when we started it on radio, Janine Garofalo and I co-hosted the show, and we, I think we were one of the few. I mean, it's certainly even on the network, without a doubt, but anywhere on commercial media, I think we were one of the few outlets where we would regularly criticize Israel. It was not necessarily in. Um,
In vogue.
no, it definitely wasn't in vogue, but
Yeah.
my critique, I think, has gotten more sophisticated over the years. But we got a call the day after we said anything negative about Israel from the Israeli embassy, and they wanted to send the ambassador onto the show, a guy named, I think it was Pincus, and I think he ultimately did come on to the show and listen to our critique. I mean, I was very critical of Sharon and at that time and the occupation, broadly speaking, but I don't know that I had as much clarity on the history. I mean, I had a good friend who did a documentary
Okay.
about.
To be fair, I will say this. What you're talking about is a time that literally predates the new historian era of Israeli history, I feel like, or was like right around the time
Oh
when the new
no, that
historian.
happened around in the 80s and 90s, but I wasn't, at that age. 80s and 90s, I'm still in my teens, early 20s, and I wasn't. But it was there. I had a friend, a guy named Benny Bruner, and you can see his documentary he did. He was Israeli, I want to say Dutch, and he did the documentary that is available. Or he's done many, but one which really struck me was called "The Great Book Robbery," and it's a documentary about trying to establish that there was, in fact, a Palestinian. The land was not empty. There was no. There was a Palestinian culture. There was a Palestinian
Yeah.
civilization. They had, and he makes that case through all the books, Palestinian books that were stolen and are actually stored in a subterranean level in the Israeli National Library that you really can't go in and see. It was very enlightening to me because as a kid you're taught like the land was empty, et cetera, et
Yeah,
cetera.
for a what is it, for a land without, for a people without land, for a land without people, or land without
Yeah,
people for a people without land.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So my critique has evolved over the time. Like I don't, I mean, I think you saw this exchange I had the other day on my show. I never labeled myself a Zionist, although I think maybe I don't know that I was ever a Zionist. Different people had maybe draw the distinctions at different points, but I never labeled myself an anti-Zionist because I don't feel like I have to participate in this concept. I believe in democracy and I believe in human rights. And I believe that if you're occupying, land illegal, it's illegal. And
Yeah.
I believe in the concept of settler colonialism, and I can make an assessment. So I think to the extent that I've been called an anti-Zionist, it's more by people who call themselves Zionists. But I don't have a problem with it being called an anti-Zionist, but it's not something that I spend time identifying myself with because, frankly, rhetorically, I don't find it particularly effective. And if it's not effective in me helping change people's minds, then I don't employ that type of stuff. But it's been a very clarifying time where people stand, and surprising in some instances too, to be honest with you.
Do you mind elaborating on your own personal journey? I've talked about mine as far as like overcoming national mythology and nationalistic myths that you learn from an early age as someone who's Turkish, who grew up in Turkey, who was a product of both the private and public education system in Turkey. I have talked about my understanding of the Armenian genocide and what was taught to me, how my opinion on it evolved from an early age, despite the attempts of indoctrination. And I was wondering if you, because I think there's a very good parallel there with respect to the Nakba and also Israel's ongoing occupation as an apartheid regime, the way that this has evolved into full-blown fascism, in my opinion, in the words not just of mine, but also a friend of both of our shows, Dr. Ofer Kasif. I think that it could be illuminating for people who are on